Did America, did the CIA coup the Australian government? Not once, but twice. That's the question I'm asking today on The Burning Archive. My name's Jeff Rich. This channel reflects on current day events with the benefit of world history. And today I'm looking at a popular theory on the internet that America and the CIA, unhappy with the direction of the Australian government, decided to replace that government using the powers of the CIA twice, once in 1975 and once in 2010. And although it's a popular theory, I do think there is a thinking trap here that we can all learn about, and I'll explain that at the end of the video. It is a popular theory. Does it really stack up? I came across this theory recently after a discussion on Jamal Thomas's channel where I was reflecting on, well, would Australia succumb to US pressure and fight China over Taiwan? I expressed some doubt about it. I thought in the end Australia would not do so, if for no other reason than the fact that it's such a mad idea. I don't think in the end the USA would even do so. But a person I really respect, KJ No, later appeared on the live stream and expressed a different view. He said that if you looked at the history of Australia, it has always been a US vassal, if you like, and that is in part because when the heat is on, the USA government has not once but twice actually replaced the Australian government because it refused to do Washington's bidding. The first case that KJ talked about, it is a popular theory, and KJ is a person I really respect. And there are a lot of other people who certainly, more particularly in the first case that KJ was talking about, the Whitlam government, have expressed this theory. But there are people out there who've written about the American government intervening in Australian government affairs in the second case in 2010 involving Kevin Rudd. So let's briefly first set the scene about what these two events are before we look about the evidence for and against whether the CIA, the American government regime, changed Australia in these two events. The first event is the Whitlam government in the early 1970s in Australia. The Whitlam government was a Labor or progressive government, in a way the last genuinely aspiring to be social democratic government in Australia, that came to power in 1972 after the Labor Party or progressive forces had been out of power since 1949, so 23 years, a very long time, and a lot of things changed about the world between 1949 and 1972. The Whitlam government is famous for a raft of reforms that it introduced, particularly around social policies and urban life, but it also had some new directions in foreign policy and tested the US partnership to some degree. It actually recognised the People's Republic of China, sort of was more actively against the Vietnam War, and did mark a significant change in Australia at a period when there was a upsurge of sort of cultural nationalism, if you like, in Australia. Patrick White won the Nobel Prize for Literature. The only Australian, although he was kind of an Anglo-Australian, to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in its history since 1901, and he won it in 1973. Some of these new directions, particularly in foreign policy and security security policy were something of a challenge. The Whitlam government had, took over the reins from a bureaucracy, a military bureaucracy, a security bureaucracy that had grown comfortable with the previous government over 23 years. So there was a lot of clashes and a lot of redirection. And it was in the era when Richard Nixon was president and that fine diplomat Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. And the story goes that because of these changes of direction, because of this questioning of the US alliance, America intervened in and couped the Australian government. Of course, there was an extra complicating factor because in Australia in 1975 there was an enormous constitutional crisis. Many would say it's probably the greatest political crisis in Australian political history because in 1975 the Whitlam government was sacked by the Governor-General, who is the constitutional monarch, the sort of representative of the Queen of England or Britain in Australia. Australia's constitution is, in practice separate from Britain, but there is a constitutional linkage there. We are a constitutional monarchy where there's a formal recognition of the Queen, but the power is vested in the Governor-General. But the Governor-General sacked the government, and it was an enormous, a democratically elected government. It was an enormous, enormous controversy. As it happened, at the subsequent election, there was a landslide victory for the opposition. The Whitlam government was swept from power. And the rest, as they say, is history. The second event that KJ No was referring to here was the Kevin Rudd government in 2010. Now, this is quite a different event. There was, if you like, an enormous political crisis in Australia, really between 2010 and 2013, I'd say. Some would say perhaps even further, because there were constant leadership challenges within the governing party, and Australia went through a period of significant political instability where the governing parties replaced their own prime ministers. First, Kevin Rudd was removed from office by Julia Gillard in 2010 by a party vote. Then Kevin Rudd struck back and removed Julia Gillard from office after, a trigger warning for Australian viewers, years and years and years of political scheming and reporting about it happening. Then Kevin Rudd lost the 2013 election. Tony Abbott became Prime Minister, and before too long, Malcolm Turnbull replaced Tony Abbott, and then Scott Morrison replaced Malcolm Turnbull. All this sort of churn of leaders. The British press had a heyday in describing Australia as the coup capital of the world. But in fact, these were all, if you like, internal power struggles within a governing party. Really not all that different to events that happen all around the world, relative powers of different factions. So they're the two big events. And you might wonder, why on earth would people say that was an American coup? Well, there were some complicating factors, and I think WikiLeaks published some documents that referred to the American ambassador having talks with some of the key power brokers in these coups, some of the key power brokers who backed Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd made a big thing of him being a Chinese language speaker, of being influential in China, and some people have interpreted that as indication that he may have been sort of, drifting away from the American orbit. But as we will see in a second, I don't think that is really true. So they're the two big events. Is it true that the CIA couped couped the governments in those two cases. As you can imagine, these events have been extensively documented and debated because the 1975 constitutional crisis was really the greatest political crisis in Australia and really formed the political outlooks of generations of politicians since, very much formed the political ethos of the subsequent Hawke-Keating government, the Labor Hawke-Keating government that took power in the early 1980s, who wanted to avoid the mistakes of the Whitlam government. There is an enormous literature on this issue. Both the question of the CIA intervention or the American intervention, but in the 1975 case also more broadly the nature of the political and constitutional crisis, because the role of the Governor-General, the British Governor, the British representative Governor-General, and indeed the role of the Queen, of the palace, has been highly controversial. Was it not only the CIA who were intervening in 1975? Did the King Charles, or I think he's now known as King Charles, but Charles Windsor, whatever his name is, and the Queen of England, did they actually intervene in Australia's domestic affairs in 1975? Well, there's many sources you can read on this. On the question of the CIA, this book here by Frank Bongiorno, if you like, it's probably the best mainstream political history of Australia that's out there at the moment. Dreamers and Schemers: A Political History of Australia. And more particularly, this book by the journalist, former intelligence official, turned journalist and long-time critic of the national security state, Brian Toohey, Secret: The Making of Australia's Security State, goes into some depth into this issue. And there is also another book by James Curran which explores the VIX relationship and the nature of the CIA operation. Very detailed. I won't go into all the detail, but to cut to the chase, the popular theory that the CIA removed Gough Whitlam because he was obstreperous or, uncooperative with American policy is not based on sound evidence. There is, however, clear evidence that the CIA or a particular operative of the CIA, who may well be familiar to any readers who follow the whole JFK saga, James Angleton, were unhappy with the government and were cooking up perhaps schemes to remove the government. James Angleton was a particularly noxious, poisonous conspiracist who in many ways probably did a lot of damage to the CIA. And he was operating in Australia at that time, and there is some evidence that he was preparing schemes to deal with the government. However, the conclusion of Toohey, Bongiorno, and James Curran is that in the end, those schemes were ignored, and the American government were persuaded that indeed they actually didn't really need to force a change in the government. They were able to actually get the government to, soften some of its rhetoric instead. And that is particularly the conclusion of Brian Toohey, who's not at all a sort of mainstream person. It turned out that Whitlam was a little bit huffy and puffy on some of these national security issues. But in the end, he and a lot of his ministers were, as loyal and supportive to the American alliance as any other Australian politician since 1942. The other dimension, I guess, to really focus on here is the 1975 constitutional crisis. And this was a crisis really driven by many other factors other than American intervention. And I guess this is where the thinking trap comes in. It's common, I guess, it's a common tendency, given that the CIA has attempted regime changes in so many places in the planet, to attribute, I guess, more power, more agency, more competence to American attempts to do various things than is really justified, and to just treat the politics of every country of the world as the kind of playground of American spies and politicians. In fact, the 1975 constitutional crisis was an enormous drama that was driven by domestic factors, the personalities involved, the legal and constitutional weaknesses of the Australian political system, and indeed the weaknesses of performance of Whitlam himself, of the opposition leader Malcolm Fraser, of John Kerr, and the failures indeed of the Whitlam government. There were some very strange shenanigans. I'm not going to go into too much detail. It probably deserves a whole separate program, but Australian viewers would absolutely be aware of some of the, the good side and the bad side of the Whitlam government. There was a former minister in the Hawke-Keating government who used to take long flights back from Canberra to WA and over a whiskey or two debate who was the worst minister in the Whitlam government. So the crisis of 1975, the actual sacking of the Governor-General, was driven by internal Australian factors. There's a huge controversy over how much or what exactly was the role of the Queen, and there's been documents released in the last few years. Some of that is explained in this book here by Jenny Hocking, The Dismissal Dossier, and you can spend the rest of your life, if you like, looking at those sort of issues. I wouldn't recommend you really do. I think it's a little bit of a local debate. I think the thing to take out of it was this is a local political crisis, which the United States was, some of the United States officials were overly bold, overly ambitious, thinking that they might play a game with, but in the end, the real events were actually decided by the Australian political actors. Okay, let's look at the second event. That's Kevin Rudd's removal in 2010. Now, again, this was actually an enormous political crisis. I was writing at the time myself about it as Australia's political crisis of 2010 to 2013, and you can read those essays in my book, 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat, and there's a link to that book in the video below. But what happened in 2010 was again a case of internal local political events in which the American representatives took an interest, but they were not the driving factors. Kevin Rudd was elected in Australia in 2007. In a huge landslide. The former Prime Minister, John Howard, who had been one of, I think, the second longest serving Prime Minister in Australian history, lost his seat at the election. And it was a sea change. There was discussion everywhere of the sort of triumphant, omnicompetent, Kevin 07, the sort of extraordinary legitimacy and mandate that Kevin Rudd had. And yet within a couple of years, this mandate dissipated in some of the internal weaknesses of the governing system in Australia, the governing party, the then Labor Party, and the internal personality weaknesses, I guess, of Kevin Rudd and the other key figures in the Labor Party. So what happened was there were a number of huge controversies. There was the global financial crisis and some huge issues to do with that. There were issues to do with health reform, which sort of collapsed. And particularly there was an issue to do with climate change. Kevin Rudd came to power saying climate change was, the greatest moral challenge of our time. He saw himself as a key figure at one of the international conferences negotiating climate change, and yet when that event happened, he was deeply wounded by the fact that the Chinese and other governments really treated Australia as marginal to the problem. He was a man of extraordinary ambition and inflated sense of importance and an inflated sense of Australia's role in the world. And that kind of got him into trouble. He even alienated the people he allegedly had such great cultural sensitivity to China. So Kevin Rudd was it's controversial, but he wasn't a great prime minister. There were a whole lot of weaknesses to Kevin Rudd. And those weaknesses and the internal chaos, because he was an especially chaotic and disorderly prime minister in many ways, a person who took so much upon himself, who had an enormous faith in himself for doing so many things, but discovered that he wasn't quite up to it. And his own party revolted in a pretty brutal, secretive way and removed him from office in, I think it was in June 2010. And look, there have been so many pages spilled in Australia about this. Kevin Rudd's written a pretty bitter biography about it. Julia Gillard's written her side of the story, and there have been many other versions of the story as well. The ABC in Australia produced an extraordinary documentary called The Killing Season, which described all of these sort of leadership coups and the conspiracies, the internal conspiracies that happened. So in amongst all of those events, the WikiLeaks report that one of those power brokers was talking with the American ambassador should be seen in that broader context. Most particularly Labor Party, but most Australian political officers do chat regularly with the American officials. There is deep penetration and influence that goes on in America, and I guess the Australian politicians are very much being groomed and normalised to sort of operate within the American alliance framework. It's not a particularly significant factor that one power broker should be trading a bit of gossip with an American ambassador. The things that really undid Kevin Rudd were the internal weaknesses, the internal party weaknesses, and the internal performance issues of Kevin Rudd. Even more so than in the case of Whitlam government, there really is no justification for saying that America couped Australia in 2010. So there we are. We have a popular theory that America couped Australia in not once but twice. The first case, 1972, 1975, there is some evidence that there were at least some people thinking about such a wild and wacky scheme, but there really is no evidence that it was actually executed. Indeed, the evidence, such as it is, suggests that wiser heads prevailed and more diplomatic forms of influence and negotiation and conformity with American interests within Australia, including in the Labor Party, prevailed. And in the second case, there really is no strong evidence for such a claim at all. It doesn't mean that Australia is not conformist with the American alliance, but I think it is a case of focusing on the wrong thing, falling into a thinking trap of overstating the influence of American geostrategists, of American intelligence agencies, of confusing an intention by some one or other rogue officers. Some bit of gossip and a few secret plans by a few rogue officers with the organised and coordinated actions of a whole government. And there is a tendency, I think, especially from American-based geopolitical commentators, to overestimate the US role. It's almost like a mirror image of that, the deep state's overestimation of its own power. It's a forgivable error, and I deeply, deeply respect someone like KJ No. It does shine a light on the wickedness of the United States constantly intervening regime change, contrary to the United Nations Charter, I might add, in governments all around the world. But I think it is a trap you shouldn't really fall into. In Australia's case, it exaggerates what happened, and it gives you the wrong impression about what happened. There are different factors, elite networks, ideological conformity, powerful commercial interests that drive Australia's unfortunate dependence on the American alliance, the American liberal rules-based order. But it is really important, especially not just in Australia's case, but all around the world. Even, for example, the current situation in Ukraine, to remember that politics is local, and just because there's something going on in the Washington Situation Room doesn't mean that events are not being driven by other local factors. So I hope this discussion of whether the CIA couped Australia in 1975 and in 2010 has helped you think a little bit more clearly about the world events of today with the benefit of history. And if you'd like to have more such discussions, why don't you go over to jeffrich.substack.com and become even a paid subscriber there. It will support my work providing independent thinking on world affairs, world culture, and you'll get a lot of great deep dives, guides, and slow reads into history to help you live in tune with the mode of a changing world. Thanks so much for watching.